Hello everyone, this video is going to be all about the different data types in Python. If you were in class these last few days, for the first 3 days of school, we did go over these, so if that is the case, you probably don't need to watch this video. But if you'd like some review, if you'd like to relook at some data types in Python, we'll also go into a little bit more detail in these videos. Then you should check out this video. All right, so when we are programming, we are always working with data. We're saving data in memory, and we are accessing that data. Sometimes we're changing that data. Sometimes we're moving that data. Sometimes we're adjusting or adding to that data or doing something to the data. But there's lots of different types of data. There are a number of categories, and they also have specific names that we'll look at today. So first category, we'll also look at the name of the data type. First category is whole numbers. So if we have whole number data types, we call these integers. Maybe we'll add some examples here. So whole numbers can be anything from 0, 15, 107, but also you could have negative numbers. -3 is an integer, same with very large negative numbers, and we can get much larger than this if we wanted to as well. What else do we have? If we have whole numbers, we also have a different data type for decimal numbers. These are numbers that have fractions, or we also call these rational or even irrational numbers. But in programming, we typically just call these decimals, and the name for these are, there's two different types, but usually we'll call these floats in Python. We call these floats because of the formula that's used to actually store this data, which is a formula we don't really need to get into that uses exponents to save data, which is where we get the term floating point. So you'll sometimes hear that as well, floating point data types, or we just call them floats. So examples of these, anything with a decimal. We could have 3.0, right? It's basically 3, but because we add the point 0, it makes it a decimal. We could have something like 7.5, or a negative number, negative 1.15. We could have a number with a lot of decimals. And we could also have irrational numbers. We'll look at some packages in this class, such as the math package or module, and they have something called math.py. And we could look at other irrational numbers too. We could use e, we could use other sciencey kind of irrational numbers as well. So anything with a decimal, positive or negative, falls in this category. What else do we have? Well, besides numbers, we often save data as words or symbols, and we call these strings. Now, strings are special because in other languages, strings are really made up of something called characters. But in Python, there is no such data type. So in Python, we just say strings. I guess we should say, I got these mixed up. We should say that these are words, letters, or even like longer pieces of writing. We'll look at some examples. And we call these strings. For example, we could have a single letter. We could have a whole word. We could have a whole sentence. I like tomatoes, period. So you can even have punctuation. You could have only punctuation. You could have numbers. Anything is going to be a string as long as we put it in these quotations. But in Python, you can also put things in apostrophes. I personally like to just use quotations just to keep it simple, to keep it consistent. But it is up to you, whatever you like to do. But they're going to be, you're going to be able to use it either way. What else do we have? Sometimes we want to be able to store something that is neither a number or a word. And that's when we want to store something that is either true or false. So something that is true or false, I guess, what do we call this? Something that's binary, something that has true or false value. It's only two options, but we'll just we'll call this true or false as the category. And the name for this in programming is Boolean. Probably a new word that you haven't seen before. Boolean, Boolean. Booleans will use only two possible data, pieces of data, either true or false. In Python, the spelling does matter. So true has to have a capital T, false has to have a capital F whenever you're using it. What else do we have? Well, we're going to have two other data types we'll look at in this class, but not so much in the early weeks. We'll look at these in the second half of the semester. And these are when we want to have lists of things. And we call these collections in Python. There are different types of collections in other languages that we'll look at, but Python has 4 main collection types that we'll use, at least for the basic ones that come in the public library. Examples of these are ones that we're going to look at later. So we're going to give some names for these, but then we'll return to these later. We have lists, which use these square brackets. We have sets, which use the parentheses. We have something called tuples. It's a funny word. They also use, wait, do they, let me mix up my symbols here. Tuples use these. Sets use the curly braces. I got them mixed up. And the last thing are called dictionaries, and they use these curly braces as well, but they're also going to have a colon in the middle for data. So when we talk about collections later in the semester, we will return to these. For now, we only care that they are technically another data type in Python. And there's one more. This is something we'll also look at later in the semester when we're working with images primarily, and we start looking at something called classes. And these are something called objects. The idea here is, what if you want to store in memory something that's like a single idea? Like we have, go back to my favorite example of a Pokemon. Right? A Pokemon is going to have a lot of different attributes that we would like to have all together. It's going to have a speed value, an HP value. It's going to have different defense values. Maybe it holds an item, and all that can actually be packaged together in something called an object. So the name of this data type is, in fact, an object. Example, maybe like we just mentioned, we have a Pokemon. Maybe we want to define a bunch of attributes for something like an employee. Maybe we want to create an object that defines an enemy for a game, or maybe some kind of for working on a website in some way. Maybe we have something for like a window or a menu or something else. Really any any concept can be made into an object. So when we are talking about these different data types, we are thinking about the data, but we don't actually have to declare what type of data we have here. In other languages, making variables might look something like this, where we say, oh, we have an integer, we give it a name, we'll call it container, and then we set it to 4. But in Python, which is a typeless language, the type is actually interpreted for us. The compiler is going to figure out what data type that variable should be based on the value we're putting into it. So in Python, we just say container is equal to 4, and we'd say that the interpreter is going to figure out for us that container is an integer, which is nice. We don't have to think so much about it. We just have to make a variable. We'll talk about variables in the next video. And once we figure out the variable name, then we just figure out what we want to store in it. Anything to the right-hand side of the variable. Later, when we look at some methods, we actually do have to know our data types. If we actually go to code here, outside our comments, we can actually see that we do have some control. We could put something in a parenthesis like this. Oh, I think like this actually. And say something like this, like 4.3. And this is actually a kind of acting like a function where we are converting this value of 4.3 to a whole number. And there's a name for this in Python. This is called casting. We'll talk more about casting in the future, but we will actually have to use some of these data types as functions for casting. Specifically, well, we might end up using the int function. We might use the float function. We might convert things to strings using the string function, which is just str. And that's probably all we will use in this class if we need to convert between these different data types. But there are other ones. We might talk more about some of these data types in the future, but this is just an intro for us to be thinking about, and also to understand that we can work with different types of data. For a lot of applications, we want to work with words. Maybe the user inputs some kind of sentence, and we have to analyze that. Maybe we're storing different setting values. Maybe something is either on or off, so we're using booleans. And we can always be working with different types of numbers. And then there's some more advanced ones that we'll look at later. But that is it for this video.